Welcome to Daily English Practice, the podcast to train your English and evolve every day. Today, we are taking you on a massive historical journey.
We really are. It's quite the timeline we're covering today.
Yeah, we're going to look at the entire history of the United States,
Ah,
from the very early colonial encounters all the way through the 20th century.
right. And the goal is to see how concepts like freedom and citizenship have been debated, defined, and, completely redefined over time.
Exactly. It's a huge topic. But when you look at the primary sources, the actual documents and artifacts, rather than just the later summaries, a very distinct pattern emerges.
It does.
Yeah.
Because what we're really looking at is a centuries-long ongoing argument about who gets to be a person under the law and, well, who gets to hold the power.
And to track that argument, we have an incredible stack of sources for today's deep dive. I mean, we are talking about archives straight from the U.S. Library of Congress and the UK National Archives.
We've got incredibly detailed legal history on the architecture of slavery, literary reviews dissecting the drafting of the Declaration of
The
Independence.
comprehensive timeline of women's suffrage, and even raw, unfiltered oral histories and personal snapshots from the Vietnam War.
Which is such a diverse collection of documents, it really allows us to see the gap between the official narrative a government tries to project and the lived reality of the people on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the beginning with the colonial era. If you look at the artifacts from the British Library collection, you see these early, complex encounters.
Like William Strachey's English Patent Dictionary.
Right, or that 1622 text detailing the Plymouth colony. But what I found really striking our sources was the perspective from across the pond.
Oh, the British perspective is fascinating.
It really is. The UK National Archives has this upcoming Revolution 250 exhibition, and historian Bruce Lenman's review of colonial wars paints a picture of the British Empire that feels totally at odds with the idea of this unstoppable mastermind imperial force.
Yeah, we do tend to project a lot of retrospective grand strategy onto the British Empire of the 1700s, like they had it all perfectly planned out.
Exactly, like it was a chess game.
But Lemon argues that their expansion was actually a disjointed series of checks, failures, and administrative missteps. The politicians in London were operating with severe tactical inflexibility.
They were just out of touch with the reality on the ground.
Completely. They were clinging to a rather mystical idea of seamless top-down sovereignty.
While the colonists in North America were developing a massive appetite for territorial expansion.
Precisely. Those two ambitions were simply incompatible. In fact, Lenman suggests that by looking at the administrative records from London, American independence was practically inevitable as early as 1760.
Wow, so long before the famous battles even began.
Long before. The bureaucratic machinery of the empire simply couldn't accommodate the reality of the colonies.
Which brings us to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. We're looking at Gary Wills's book, Inventing America, where he dives into the actual philosophy Thomas Jefferson was pulling from when he wrote the draft.
And this challenges a lot of what we're traditionally taught.
It really does. We are almost always taught that Jefferson was a strict disciple of John Locke, and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was basically just a poetic spin on Locke's protection of private property.
Right, the classic property rights argument.
But Wills argues that's a misreading of Jefferson's influences.
Because you have to think about the intellectual climate Jefferson was actually steeped in. Wills makes a compelling case that Jefferson was heavily influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment.
Philosophers like David Hume and Thomas Reid.
Exactly. And unlike Locke, who was heavily focused on the individual and the accumulation of property, the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers proposed that humans are driven by a built-in moral empathy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If Jefferson is writing through the lens of Scottish moral sense philosophy, it completely changes the meaning of the Declaration.
What's fascinating here is how it reframes the entire document. For Jefferson, the pursuit of happiness didn't mean chasing personal wealth or individualistic success.
It wasn't about the hustle.
Not at all. It meant the pursuit of a natural moral good based on mutual benevolence. It was a communitarian ideal, the idea that you find true happiness in the flourishing of your community.
And when he wrote that all men are created equal, he wasn't talking about equality before the law or equality in the marketplace, which obviously didn't exist at the time.
Right. He meant that all humans share the exact same innate moral sense, the same human heart.
The heart over the head. He really believed people were united by emotion. And you can see that raw emotion in the draft he presented to the Continental Congress.
The draft that they immediately proceeded to hack to pieces.
Yeah, they really tore it apart. Congress excised a massive 300-word section where Jefferson aggressively attacked his British brethren. Reading the deleted text, he sounds genuinely heartbroken.
He does.
He's basically saying, "You've stabbed us in the heart, you've killed our brotherly affection."
Because Jefferson viewed the drafting as a painful emotional severing of ties with unfeeling relatives. But the Continental Congress was operating on a strictly pragmatic level.
They needed to get a deal done.
Exactly. They needed a clean, focused propaganda overture to secure a military alliance with France. They didn't want a long, emotional diatribe about broken brotherhood.
And they also completely removed his passages condemning the transatlantic slave trade.
They did,
Huh?
because acknowledging the moral abomination of the slave trade in their founding document would immediately fracture the fragile coalition between the northern and southern colonies.
So the final document was a calculated political compromise, not just a pure philosophical manifesto. And speaking of that tension between philosophical ideals and messy reality, I was stunned by a detail in the War Department records.
From the National Archives, right?
Yes. We have this image of the Revolutionary War being meticulously documented, but most of the official U.S. military records from that era were completely destroyed.
They burned. First in a major fire in the War Department in 1800, and then again when the British burned Washington during the War of 1812.
Which is wild to think about. The only reason historians have a decent understanding of the military administration from the Revolution is because the government later went out and purchased the personal papers of a man named Timothy Pickering.
Who had served as the quartermaster general.
Right. The official government archive went up in smoke, and a single officer's personal files ended up saving the administrative history of the war.
But that fragility of the historical record isn't just about lost papers. It's about whose humanity was officially recorded in the first place, and how the law was used to systematically erase it.
That is a crucial point.
If we look at Paul Finkelman's detailed legal history of slavery, we can see exactly how the mechanics of human bondage were engineered in the colonies.
Yeah, reading through Finkelman's analysis of early Virginia highlighted a massive legal vacuum. When the English arrived in Jamestown, they didn't have a legal framework for slavery.
Because the Spanish and the French could look back to Roman law to legally justify holding humans as property, but English common law had absolutely no tradition of it.
They had no legal precedent for owning a human being at all.
So the Virginia colony had to invent the legal machinery of slavery entirely from scratch.
Yeah.
And they do it through a series of highly calculated statutes.
Like the case in 1640.
Yes, an African man named John Punch ran away with 2 European indentured servants. When they were caught, the Europeans were given extra years of service as punishment. But the courts sentenced John Punch to lifetime servitude.
It was a definitive, documented shift toward race-based bondage.
But the statute that Finkelman highlights as the most devastating turning point came in 1662, the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum.
I saw this in the notes. How did that actually work in practice?
Under traditional English common law, a child's legal status always followed the father. But Virginia deliberately reversed this for enslaved women.
They adopted a concept from Roman law.
Exactly, a law that was originally used for livestock, the rule that the offspring of a female animal belongs to the owner of the mother.
That is incredibly dark.
By applying this agricultural law to human beings, the statute dictated that a child's status followed the mother.
Meaning the mixed-race children of white masters and enslaved women were born legally as slaves, owned by their own fathers.
It legally stripped enslaved women of any rights to their own children, and legally reduced human reproduction to the generation of property.
And they just kept reinforcing this legal wall. By 1667, they passed a law stating that baptizing a slave into Christianity did not make them free.
And 2 years later, they decreed that if a master killed a slave while punishing them, it could not be considered premeditated murder.
Because the logic written into the law was that no man would intentionally destroy his own property. They were constantly bouncing between recognizing enslaved people as humans who could think and rebel, and defining them legally as inanimate property to be protected.
And that profound contradiction didn't go away with independence. It was baked right into the 1787 Constitution.
Because the framers protected slavery without ever allowing the word slave into the document.
They used euphemisms. The Three-Fifths Clause gave Southern states outsized political representation based on human beings they legally defined as property.
And the Fugitive Slave Clause referred to persons held to service or labor.
Then, when you traced how the U.S. Supreme Court handled this over the next century, you see the federal government doubling down on reducing humans to property. Finkelman details the Antelope case from 1825, which is just surreal to read.
That was the case with the intercepted ship, right?
Yes, a ship full of captured Africans was intercepted. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that while the slave trade was against natural law, it was valid under international law.
But the most jarring detail is how they resolved it. The court literally used a lottery system to decide which 39 of the Africans would be handed over to a Spanish claimant as slaves and which would go free,
They drew lots for human lives in the highest court in the land.
treating people exactly as if they were distributing seized maritime cargo.
Then in 1842, you have Prigg v. Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court ruled that a master had a common law right of recaption,
Which essentially meant a slave owner could seize an alleged runaway slave anywhere at any time.
completely bypassing local state laws that were meant to protect free black people from kidnapping. The court affirmed that a human being could be treated exactly the same as a runaway horse or a piece of stolen furniture.
And all of this culminates in the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney explicitly declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States.
Writing that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. It is essential for you, the listener, to consider how these rulings illustrate the mechanics of oppression.
It wasn't just a cultural attitude.
No, it was a highly sophisticated legal system, carefully engineered, statute by statute, to strip away personhood.
And that engineering of the law to exclude certain groups didn't stop at the end of the Civil War. If we move the timeline forward and look at the Rutgers University timeline of women's suffrage, we see a parallel struggle for citizenship.
The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but when the 14th and 15th Amendments were drafted to establish equal protection and voting rights, they explicitly added the word male to the Constitution for the first time.
Women who had fought for abolition alongside men were completely left behind by the very amendments meant to expand freedom.
The suffrage movement, which had formally organized around the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, found itself in a grueling war of attrition.
And it really fractured the movement. By 1869, you had Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton forming one faction focused entirely on forcing a federal constitutional amendment.
While Lucy Stone led another faction focused on a slow, state-by-state approach.
And progress was agonizingly slow. Colorado became the first state to grant women the vote via state amendment in 1893, but a federal amendment seemed impossible.
The turning point really comes in the 20th century when the movement radicalized. In 1913, Alice Paul formed what would become the National Woman's Party.
She had observed the militant tactics of the suffragettes in Britain and brought that energy to the U.S.
Exactly. They stopped politely asking for the vote and started demanding it. They were the first group to ever picket the White House.
And they did it right during World War I, which absolutely infuriated the government. In 1917, Alice Paul and dozens of other picketers were arrested on bogus charges of obstructing traffic.
And thrown into the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia.
But Paul didn't back down. She initiated a hunger strike.
The conditions in that workhouse were brutal, and the government attempted to force-feed the women to break the strike, but the press got wind of what was happening.
The public outcry over the torture of American women who were simply asking for the right to vote became a massive political liability for President Woodrow Wilson.
Because he was trying to project this image of the United States fighting for global democracy in Europe, while simultaneously jailing women demanding democracy at home.
It was a terrible look for him.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, look at the leverage that created. In January 1918, President Wilson finally formally endorsed the federal women's suffrage amendment.
But he didn't frame it as a sudden moral awakening, did he?
Not at all. He framed it to Congress as a war measure, an urgent necessity to unify the country and maintain the moral high ground during World War I.
That sounds incredibly similar to how Abraham Lincoln framed the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War.
It is a striking historical parallel. Both Lincoln and Wilson utilized the justification of a war measure to push through monumental expansions of human rights.
It highlights a recurring pattern in history. Fundamental rights are often finally conceded by the state, not out of pure benevolence, but under the immense geopolitical and social pressure of wartime necessity.
That tension between the state and the citizen during times of extreme crisis is a perfect lens for our next set of sources.
Right. Using the Library of Congress primary source collections, we are jumping into the massive crises of the 20th century, starting with the Great Depression.
We all know the basic timeline, the 1929 stock market crash leading to massive unemployment, but the archival sources point out A really cruel paradox of the era.
The paradox of abundance. You had a country possessing the most productive industrial and agricultural capacity in the world, generating massive food surpluses.
Yet, the legal and economic architecture completely failed to distribute that abundance.
Hundreds of thousands of unemployed Americans were roaming the country on foot and in boxcars, facing actual starvation. They were living in makeshift cardboard shacks mockingly called Hoovervilles right on the edges of major cities.
All while crops literally rotted in fields because the market mechanisms had collapsed.
And that profound failure of the social contract led directly to the Bonus Army March. In the summer of 1932, nearly 20,000 World War I veterans, many of them destitute and starving, marched on Washington, D.C.
They were demanding early payment of cash bonuses for their military service that weren't legally due to be paid until 1945.
They set up huge camps across the river from the capital, peacefully pressing their case to the government they had fought for, and the government's response was chilling.
On July 28th, U.S. troops, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, were ordered to disperse the veterans. MacArthur utilized cavalry, infantry with fixed bayonets, and tear gas.
He even deployed tanks against the camps.
Thanks against American veterans.
The U.S. military used tanks to clear out its own starving veterans. The official military reports often framed these actions as necessary for maintaining public order against a radical threat.
But the lived reality of the citizens on the ground was that the state had turned its weapons on the very people who had defended it.
This tension between the official, sanitized government narrative and the raw reality experienced by the citizen is perfectly captured in our final source.
The Veterans History Project collection on the Vietnam War.
During the Cold War era, 2.7 million Americans served in country in Vietnam. The Library of Congress curated oral histories and materials from veterans dispatched everywhere, from the streets of Saigon to the besieged combat base at Quyon.
And what stands out so powerfully when you look through this archive is the stark contrast in the photography.
You have the official military photography. Images approved and released by the government, designed to project a specific, orderly narrative of the war's progress and purpose.
But right alongside those, the archive holds the personal, casual snapshots taken by the troops themselves on their own personal cameras.
When you look at those raw snapshots side by side with the official portraits, the difference is night and day.
The soldiers' photos show the exhaustion, the deep mud, the fear, the chaotic downtime, and the intense camaraderie.
This raises an important question for historians: which collection of images tells the true story of the war?
The personal snapshots challenge the official narrative at every turn. They prove that the true reality of a historical event is very rarely found in the neat official government press release.
It is found in the dirt and the personal experiences of the individuals who actually had to live through it.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have. We started with early dictionaries and Thomas Jefferson drafting philosophical documents based on Scottish empathy.
We walked through the dark legal definitions of human beings as property and women going on hunger strikes in workhouses to force the president's hand.
The starvation of the Great Depression alongside food surpluses, and finally the personal snapshots of soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam.
And the ultimate takeaway from all these archives is that history is never a clean, inevitable line of progress.
It is a messy, ongoing, and highly fragile debate.
Our understanding of the past is heavily dependent on who holds the power to write the laws, who is permitted to be defined as a citizen, and just as importantly, who manages to keep the records.
Which brings me to a final thought for you, the listener, to take away today. Throughout this deep dive, we've seen how our entire understanding of reality depends on surviving archives.
The history of the Revolution was shaped because a War Department building burned down, but a quartermaster's personal papers happened to survive.
The unvarnished truth of Vietnam was captured not by government agencies, but in the personal, casual snapshots of teenagers in a war zone. Think about the text messages you send, the digital footprint you leave, and the everyday photos you are capturing on your phone right now.
Which of your casual, everyday records might miraculously survive the next few centuries to completely redefine the reality of the 21st century for historians hundreds of years from now?
It is a profound realization. You are not just observing history, you are actively generating the primary sources of the future.
You absolutely are.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. Thank you so much for joining us on Daily English Practice, the podcast, to train your English and evolve every day.
It's been a great journey today.
If you enjoyed this historical debate from the very beginning to the present days, please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share this with your friends so we can keep bringing you these incredible stories. Keep practicing, keep questioning, and we will see you next time.